Welcome to Bloomberg North. I'm Rudyard Griffiths. Every Monday, we explore a different international issue or event that's moving markets and affecting your investments. Tonight, we go deep into the world of central banks and their extraordinary efforts to generate sustained economic growth. As more economies flirt with disinflation and economic stagnation, central bankers are pushing the limits of monetary policy, from zero-bound interest rates to quantitative easing and now negative interest rates. Will central banks' monetary experimentation end in a lasting recovery, or are they sowing the seeds of the next global financial crisis? Consider this. Since the financial crisis in 2008, central banks around the world have cut rates 637 times. They've made $12.3 trillion worth of asset purchases, and $8.3 trillion of global government debt is now yielding 0% or less. 5 countries now have negative interest rates. With all these unique policy decisions, what do we have to show for it? Global growth is anemic. The U.S. economy is projected to eke out something in the order of 1.7% growth this year. Some bears out there are warning that another recession is possible in 2016. That has the Bank of America Merrill Lynch coining a new term for such central bank action: quantitative failure. In a recent note to clients, Chief Investment Strategist Michael Hartnett wrote, whether the tipping point was the Fed hike, negative rates in Europe and Japan, or simply growing market disallocations and macro misallocations of resources and wealth, the deflationary theme of quantitative failure is stalking the financial markets. Joining me now is Stephen Roach, the former chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia, and now senior fellow at Yale University's Jackson Institute of Global Affairs. Stephen, great to have you on the program. I want to start with some recent comments you've made. You've characterized negative interest rates as an act of desperation by central banks, maybe a final act of desperation in your words. Unpack that for us. What were you getting at?
Well, look, Roger, they've exhausted the traditional arsenal of positive interest rates. Then they've gone to this unconventional asset purchases, the quantitative easing, and as those first 2 measures have failed to gain traction in the real economy, which is what they're trying to do, they said, okay, let's try something else. We're going to go to negative interest rates, which means we're going to charge banks, assess them a penalty if they don't lend. And I think this one's even riskier than the first 2 because it could well force banks to make unsound loans that they'll end up regretting and significantly impair their own balance sheets.
Now, when you look at the effects of all these policies together, these banks have really targeted asset prices. They feel that rising asset prices is going to create a wealth effect, and that wealth effect in turn is a tide that lifts all boats. You don't buy that hypothesis?
No, I really don't. I think it's dangerous because what we've seen repeatedly as central banks have really aimed their arsenal on asset markets, that the asset markets have gotten away from them. They've been subjected to a lot of speculative liquidity injections, and the asset markets ultimately end up forming bubbles. We saw that with .com in the U.S. in the late 90s. We saw it with credit and mortgage markets in the mid-2000s. We saw that with the peripheral European economies, Portugal, Italy, Ireland, Greece, and Spain in the mid-2000s. This is a recipe that I think is fraught with peril insofar as financial stability is concerned. And you interact that with a debt cycle, and you get pretty serious consequences as a result.
Well, I mean, where do you think this goes from here, though? Because, defenders of the central banks would say politicians haven't acted in some major economies. We haven't seen, the classical fiscal stimulus that might support more sustainable growth. So what are central banks to do in the face of, if not outright deflation, a broad global disinflationary trend?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think number one, to the point of your question, with central bankers really taking the lead in utilizing so much stimulus and getting a lot of response from markets, but very little response from the economies, this market euphoria has effectively dampened the urgency for fiscal authorities and for politicians to act. They're saying, well, look, central banks are getting these results. Why should we act? And I think that's a big strategic mistake. And secondly, I would say that the main flaw of what central bankers are doing here is a strategic flaw. Their aggressive actions in the depths of the crisis of 08 and 09 did indeed save the system. But the mistake they've made is to conclude that those heroic actions in the depths of the crisis are sufficient then to foster and jumpstart economic recovery. And crisis and recovery are two different things. And every recovery around the world, whether it's the US, Japan, Europe, even in the face of these extraordinary actions, has been pathetically weak. And so you'd think by now, the authorities would wake up and see the handwriting on the wall that these are policies by central banks that all they do is boost markets and cause potential bubbles, but they don't get after the real economic problems, and the fiscal authorities need to do that.
So if your view is that, look, we need a balance sheet recovery, we need these zombie consumers to come off the sidelines to spend again on the basis that they've paid down debt and they have that capacity, then what's Stephen Roach's policy prescription here to put the global economy back on track?
Well, there's no silver bullet, but I focus a lot on the savings imbalances that still exist in the world. The U.S., for example, we consume too much and we save too little, our consumption growth has been anemic in response. We've grown real personal consumption by 1.5% over the past 8 years on average. We need savings incentives. We need to expand our tax-free retirement accounts. We need to provide special savings incentives for low and middle income families. We need to use our tax system as an automatic vehicle to siphon refunds into savings accounts. And we need returns for savers. We need much higher interest rates to encourage individuals that saving makes sense again. We don't do that because it's politically not expedient to force families to maybe cut back a little bit on excess spending and set aside some for future spending. We don't like to think long term. We want instant gratification.
Instant gratification, indeed. Let's end, Stephen, just by having you reflect. I'm not asking for investment advice here. You're a senior fellow at the Jackson Institute there, but just to give us your sense of how people should think about what to do with their assets, their money in this age of central banks, this age where our futures are tied up in what these vast institutions are doing to the global economy.
Again, I think that's a terrific question. I think that individual investors as well as institutional investors have to face up to the fact that the prices of major asset classes, whether they are equities or bonds or even foreign exchange rates, are not being set by the markets. They're being manipulated by central banks. So you really, as an investor, whether, again, you're an institutional or an individual investor, you can't trust the markets to give you accurate signals of how to allocate your capital. So you have to think long-term and look through this period of heavy intervention by central banks and choose the asset class that's most comfortable with your long-term investment objectives. And for different types of individuals, depending on need and age, those conclusions will be different. There's no one size fits all. But most importantly, this distortion to asset prices by central banks is really causing serious damage to long-term asset allocation decisions, and investors should be aware of that.
Well, Stephen Roach, always provocative, always insightful. Thank you so much for coming on Bloomberg North today.
Thank you.